Imagine the scene. An old, dusty New York City courtroom in 1735. The audience leans forward to hear a soft-spoken lawyer argue for his client. On one side of the room sits New York's colonial governor, William Crosby. On the other sits a poor print shop owner named Peter Singer. The gravity of the situation is clear to everyone present, yet no one there could know that the jury would be deciding what would be one of the most important court cases in all of American history, a case that some 40 years later would help spark the Revolution. You see, because our Revolution was unlike any other war that came before it. It wasn't a war simply over land or king's honor or revenge. It was a war over ideals and principles, and ideas that could change the world. And the way that those ideas spread from the minds of men like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to the bakers and the blacksmiths of the colonies was through the rambunctious, unapologetic, often profane colonial newspapers. Newspapers that were far freer than any other in the world. Freedom of the press was crucial to America on the verge of revolution. And newspapers back then could make even the most belligerent BuzzFeed article seem respectful and tame by comparison. In his book, Infamous Scribblers, Eric Burns described this as a press who berated, exaggerated, and libeled, specialized in foul-mouthed impertinence, had no qualms about accusing others of blasphemy, and on many times would accuse editors of rival newspapers of being traitors, demagogues, and madmen. In one case, saying that a man should not be spat upon in the street because it would be a waste of good saliva. Unquote. And that press, that gloriously rowdy press, was able to thrive because of the hard work and bravery of Peter Singer and the men who stood by him that fateful day in 1735. It all began a few years earlier when Governor Crosby first set foot on American soil. Now, at the time, most governors were only really in it for the money, but Crosby abused his position in especially egregious ways, using it to line his own pockets. He made enemies, and some of those enemies decided to fight back. One such man was James Alexander, a prominent lawyer in New York City who, along with other prominent men, devised a plan. They would create a newspaper that would call out what the governor was doing. The only problem was they needed a printer who was brave enough to actually publish it. And they found that man in Peter Singer, and the New York Weekly Journal was born. Now, at the time, there were only 8 colonial newspapers, and by modern standards, they were, well, boring. The news they would report would often be weeks old and rarely controversial. Nevertheless, those in power were skeptical, and for an editor, imprisonment was simply a risk of doing business. But it was clear from the beginning that the journal was not out to pull any punches. Consider this excerpt. A governor turned rogue does 1,000 things for which a lesser rogue should deserve a halter, unquote. Reporting like this made the journal wildly popular. And over the coming months, the governor became increasingly frustrated, attempting to have Singer brought up on charges multiple times, but every instance a grand jury failed to indict him. Eventually, his patience wore thin, though, and he had Singer unlawfully arrested for the crime of libel. Now, in U.S. law for today, for a statement to be considered libelous, it must be both untrue and damaging to somebody's reputation. However, in English common law, it didn't matter if what you were saying were the truth or not. It only mattered whether it hurt somebody's reputation. And the journal aimed to do that. Immediately, James Alexander sprung to the defense of his friend, and the governor responded by having him disbarred. Things looked grim. And as the date for the trial approached, the conviction of Singer was all but certain. However, at the 11th hour, help came from Philadelphia. Andrew Hamilton, friend of James Alexander and by far the most famous lawyer in all the colonies, stepped in to represent Singer. However, he didn't argue that Singer was innocent. Instead, he argued that the law itself was wrong, and that you should be able to call out injustice and proclaim the truth. And the jury agreed and acquitted Singer of all charges, setting the precedent that would allow a free press to thrive in the colonies. In the ensuing decades, the colonies underwent an information revolution. The number and influence of newspapers exploded, and by the time the Stamp Act was passed in 1735, nearly all 25 colonial newspapers opposed it loudly and passionately. But most importantly, by preaching about the ideals of liberty and freedom, these newspapers helped forge in the Americans our own unique American identity, separate from that of Great Britain. Now, we're in the midst of our own information revolution. The speed and spread of information and misinformation can be dizzying, and anyone can be a Peter Singer and print whatever blasphemous, profane thing he wants. Yet, rather than unite us, it seems only to divide us. Instead, what should unite us is a recommitment to those ideals in our revolution, and the idea that we have a right and a duty to proclaim truth to power and to call out injustice. And that's a right that we might not have if it weren't for a humble print shop owner armed with only a printing press and the truth.
A little over 242 years ago, 56 colonists met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to sign their name to a document stating that they had had enough of Britain telling them what to do. They were a wealthy group. 23 of them were lawyers, 16 plantation owners, 12 were merchants, 4 planters, and 1 was a minister. The Northerners were there because they were angered over Britain's tax on tea, which had in turn hurt their business interest. And the Southerners were there because they were fearful of Britain's pledge to free American slaves, which had been made nearly a year prior when the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. Now, just for a moment, I'd like you to reflect on my previous statements and ask yourself if they accurately represent the causes of the American Revolution and the motivations of the American patriots. They don't. What they do represent, however, is a belief of tribalism, or the notion that each individual belongs to larger groups, and that the actions that individuals take should be to advance the goals of the groups they belong to. Now, tribalism isn't new. It's been part of humanity since our very inception. In the age of early humans, it was an important tool for survival, as communities needed to band together for common defense and welfare. But tribalism has one very serious flaw. As the needs of the group or tribe increase, the liberties of those within the tribe begin to fade away. Now, eventually, technology such as agriculture would increase our chances of survival, but it would not eliminate our penchant for tribalism. This can be seen throughout history, as the power within societies has typically been vested within tribes or groups of people. Groups that not only existed in the wild, such as the weak and the strong, but groups such as the rich and the poor, the landowning and the serfs. In England, the nation that would eventually lead to the creation of the United States, power was vested in a group of wealthy aristocrats led by a royal family and determined by bloodlines. This group thought themselves superior over all others and defended their interests at all costs, even when that meant infringing on the rights and interests of others. The Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and the Intolerable Acts were all laws passed by these wealthy power holders in order to protect their own interests, and they were all laws that infringed on the rights of the American colonists whom they viewed as lesser. Most importantly, they were all laws that led directly to the American Revolution. And they led to the American Revolution not because they infringed on the rights of the colonists, but because they did so without representation, stripping the colonists of their foremost right as citizens. When the American patriots rebelled, they were not rebelling for their own personal interest, but rather they were rebelling against the notion that a handful of men could determine the fate of an entire nation, and for the notion instead that a government's legitimacy is based on the consent of its citizens, and that power should be vested within the individual, not an individual or group of wealthy elites. And when power was vested within the individual, people began to be viewed as individuals. During the American Revolution, Northerners and Southerners fought side by side against the British, many in integrated units, which would not be seen again until 1948. And in many ways, our nation during the Revolution was more united than it would be nearly a century later, because sadly, after the Revolutionary War, many Americans began to revert back to humanity's nature of tribalism. Fueled by increasing divisions between a merchant North and agricultural South, and by a heated debate over slavery, our nation would be led into a great civil war. But even for nearly 100 years after our Civil War, we would continue to divide ourselves into groups: Northerners and Southerners, male and female, black and white. Though many of these tensions are now relieved, we still sometimes find ourselves reverting back to tribalism, such as when we are told to participate in identity politics, and vote for a candidate based on the groups that they belong to rather than the ideals that they hold or the content of their character. Or when we prejudge someone based on their race, gender, occupation, or hometown. But whenever we find the inclination to revert back to tribalism, we must remember the ideals of our founding fathers and of our American patriots. We must step forward and preserve our nation's mindset of individualism, and we must view ourselves not as separate groups, but as individuals and as Americans. If men such as Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Horatio Gates, Francis Marion, and Crispus Attucks, men as diverse in their backgrounds as America herself, could unite as one under one American creed, a creed which states that the United States is a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people, a democracy and a republic, a sovereign nation made up of many sovereign states, a perfect union, one and inseparable, founded upon those ideals of freedom, justice, equality, and humanity. If the American patriots could put aside their tribalism and their divisions over 200 years ago and unite as one, then so can we unite. And so can we, through our trials, turmoils, and tribulations, remain united as one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
In many situations, it comes down to one person to save the day. The American Revolution is no exception. Whether it's a midnight ride to cast a tie-breaking vote or personally funding troops with needed equipment, one's character and work ethic will show through the centuries. One such influential yet unsung patriot was Caesar Rodney. Caesar Rodney was born near Dover, Delaware, on October 7, 1728. Throughout his life, he held many positions as a public servant, including soldier, general, and judge, sheriff, and captain in the militia. He was a member of the First and Second Continental Congresses, Committee of Correspondence, Stamp Act Congress, Council of Safety, and Delaware Supreme Court. He signed the Articles of Association, the Declaration of Independence, and helped draft the Articles of Confederation. He was also governor of Delaware. Phew! Any one of these positions could have been a full-time job. Caesar Rodney is said to have held, at one point or another, almost every significant public office. His dedication and unwavering work ethic is a great example for us all. Rodney would have already made his mark on America, but his greatest legacy was his midnight ride for independence. In June of 1776, the discussion of independence was well underway. The decision had to be unanimous, but Delaware was divided on the issue. Thomas McCain was for independence, and George Read was against it. That left the deciding vote up to Rodney, who was at the time in Delaware, dealing with the militia and his frail health. After receiving word from McCain on July 1st, he traveled over 80 miles to Philadelphia through terrible thunderstorms. The trip could have easily been fatal for Rodney due to his severe asthma and cancer. Thankfully, he arrived at Independence Hall just in time to cast his vote for independence. If it wasn't for Rodney, the Declaration wouldn't have been accepted at that meeting. If our independence wasn't declared at that point, it is fair to ask if it ever would have been. How much easier would it have been for him to have stayed in Delaware and missed the vote? Or for him to say, they don't need me, they'll figure it out. If he had even waited till the morning to leave, he would have missed the vote by a day, and we would be paying the consequences 242 years later. But instead, without regard to personal health and safety, he put his country, our country, first. Rodney had suffered from disfiguring facial cancer and severe asthma. The cancer could have been removed in England, but because he had devoted his life to the new nation, they would have sooner removed his head than removed the cancer. Sadly, Rodney never saw the end of the war for which he sacrificed so much. Caesar Rodney died in June of 1782. Rodney was able to make a huge impact on Delaware and this country, despite many obstacles. Like Thomas Jefferson said, nothing can stop the man with the right mental attitude from achieving his goals. Nothing on earth can help the man with the wrong mental attitude. Maybe that is part of the problem today. People have the wrong mental attitude. They think that society owes them everything, when in fact, it owes us nothing. We have to work to make a living. We have to work to get ahead. And we have to work to preserve our freedoms. Charles A. Goodrich wrote in his 1831 book, The Lives of the Signers of the Declaration, "It would be unnecessary, were it in our power, to add anything further on the character of Mr. Rodney. He was a man of great integrity and of pure patriotic feeling. He delighted, when necessary, to sacrifice his private interests for the public good." That is what we need today, men to whose character we have nothing to add. But sadly, somehow, Rodney is remembered only on a few memorials in Delaware, in the 1999 Delaware State Quarter, and in the minds of a few patriotic people, which of course includes all of us. We have no idea what this country will be like 242 years from now, and what our effect will be. But in this country, we have the privilege to exercise our vote and so influence history. All it takes is one vote to make the difference. One of the lessons men like Caesar Rodney leave us is to do everything we do, no matter what it is, wholeheartedly. In our home, in our job, and in our protection of the American way, our character and our perseverance will show. What we do today in our stand for freedom may end up making the difference between our great-grandchildren being Americans or citizens of some new nation. After all, freedom is only ever one generation from being lost. Let our generation do everything we can to preserve it.